Welcome to our panel, Fantasy Without Magic, starring Nicole Gibbons Kurtz, John Walker, Ryan Van Loan, and Anna Kashina. Woo! Woo! If you are not expecting Fantasy Without Magic, you are in the wrong place, but stay anyway, because we are going to explore fantasy worlds without magic that aren't classically low fantasy, focused on the military or set in the Roman Empire, Arthurian England. Yawn. What are the best examples of this genre and what makes them fantasy? I have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we launch into this topic, which we're all super excited about. I am Kelly Robson. I am she, her. I'm your moderator. The panel is being recorded. Please do submit questions via the Q&A function on the bottom ribbon. So the chat function, Q&A, or don't use the chat function for that, use the Q&A function on your bottom ribbon of the window. We will answer submitted questions, I think, towards the end of the panel, and probably at about 20 to the hour. And at this moment, I'm going to call on our panelists to introduce themselves and remind you to keep it brief, though please do tell us what thing you have out there in the world right now that people can or should or must absolutely definitely read. And I'm going to call on Ryan first.
Hey everyone, my name is Ryan Van Loan. I write epic fantasy. I have a trilogy out with Tor. My debut launched last year. It's called The Sin and the Steel. It's about a street rat autodidact private investigator, the first of her kind in her world, and she's determined to upend her corrupt society and takes on the gods to do so. And the sequel, The Justice and Revenge, drops in July on the 13th.
Amazing. Nicole, please tell us all about you.
I'm Nicole Gibbons Kurtz, and I am the owner of Mocha Memoirs Press. But I also released my fantasy mystery series called Kill Three Birds, and its sequel, A Theft Most Foul. So we have is an investigative hawk in a fantasy setting in the kingdom of Avis, no magic, that investigates supernatural crimes that occur that the Eagles in the local police cannot resolve. So.
Sounds fantastic. John, over to you.
I'm John Walker. I've put out a series called the Stadford Chronicles about a private detective of the gods. Think Magnum PI meets American Gods, and with a lot of cussing and a lot of fist fights, and guy gets turned pretty much a chew toy. I'm also working on a serial post-apocalyptic Western, which I haven't decided where I'm going to publish it yet. I might just throw it on Reddit and say, hey, enjoy. Yeah.
That's you. Anna, hi.
Hi, my name is Anna Kashina. I write epic fantasy with a lot of sword fighting and elements of romance. So my most recent publications were 4 books with Angry Robot Books publisher, and 3 were a trilogy called Magic Code, and the latest release is Shadow Blade, which is kind of set in a Middle Eastern style empire and has a lot of sword fighting. And I think it has no magic, I believe. So
amazing. That sounds so good. So even in the introductions, we've already touched on the topic, which is fantasy without magic. It seems like everybody has been writing it, except maybe Ryan. I have not written fantasy without magic myself, though now I'm thinking, what a challenge. That sounds fantastic. Ryan, tell us about your relationship. I'm going to ask all of the panelists, but tell us about your relationship with fantasy without magic. You read it, you write it, you love it.
Yeah, I definitely love it. I would say, the current series that I have, especially in the first book, there's not a ton of magic in there. At least the main characters aren't doing the magic. So there's that. But I mean, as a reader, one of the first kind of series that I got into when I was, I don't know, 9 or 10 was the Redwall series with Brian Jackson and that whole series, and really love that. Totally fantastical, not obviously not fantasy. Followed that up with Watership Down, shortly after there, Rats of Nim. So tons of kind of anthropomorphic animal stories. And I'm sure we'll get into this. There's a bunch of others, Outlander, Hill House, The Talisman. Kind of horror, I think, plays a lot of fantastical settings and elements of fantasy without magic necessarily. And Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern, at least in the beginning, I would argue is fantasy without magic. It has dragons. I think the secret is that science fiction is actually at play here, but and maybe that's functioning sort of as a quasi magic, but lifelong reader of those sorts of stories. Still a big sucker for adult stories that are animals that are in fantastical settings. So yeah.
Very cool. Nicole, how do you come to this genre?
I have to unmute myself. So my first fantastic story was Where the Wild Things Are, which is fantasy, but does not have any magic, right? So Max goes and travels to where the wild things are, and he spends time with them and becomes king of all the wild things, but there is absolutely no magic involved, right? And so you think about that being like my first introduction to fantastic settings, but without a lot of magic or any magic at all. I am a huge Stephen King Dark Tower fan. And so a lot of what happens in Gilead and in the other worlds are not magic. It's just the way that world is set up. Finnies and, those things, just the things that happen, just happen. They don't, because that's the way the world functions. It's not, even though the Man in Black can do magic, it's not magical. It's manipulation. It's psychological manipulation in some instances. It's physical intimidation in some instances. And so a lot of what happens in the Dark Tower opus, because it's all these books that are kind of tied in, are just the functionality of that world. It's a fantastic, or worlds in this case. As Jake would say, there are more worlds than this. So all these different worlds have different functionality, different types of science and gravity in the way things work. It isn't magic, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the way things work. I would dare say Full Metal Alchemist, which is an anime, they don't look at it as magic either. It's alchemy, it's science. It's our version of science on this side of the wall. And so it's not magical for the alchemy that they do. It's just a functionality of how they do, what works in their world. And so it's not magical. No one's casting their spells. They're just doing alchemy, right? They're just existing. And so these are the types of things that I enjoy, is making sure that it's not totally reliant on magic. It's just the way this world functions in a fantastic setting. And when I sat down to write the Kingdom of Avis series, the Kingdom of Avis is a kingdom that's not set in our world. It's fantastic. But I wanted to do something that didn't involve our usual tropes, dwarves, elves, golems, I wanted something else. And so I went through all the lists, and I'm like, I can't do werewolves, I can't do vampires, because they totally belong. So by the time I got to the end of my list, can't do sheep, got to what I use birds, because birds are a huge classification of species. There's like all kinds of different kinds, just huge opportunities for it, very much like Redwall and some of these other, you have anthropomorphic titles. Even though the people are humanoid, they have bird-like characteristics. And so they are able to, like my protagonist is a hawk. And so she's an investigative hawk because she can see the unseen, right? She has superhuman sight. And actually, the more she uses her hawk vision, the more difficult it is for her to return to her human vision. And eventually she'll go blind. That's the curse for all hawks. But it isn't magic. They're just born like that, right? That's just the functionality of their world. And so I think when we talk about fantastic settings without magic, that's what we're talking about. It's a fantastic setting. It's somewhere else. It doesn't exist in our world. It's different. But in the functionality of physics, the functionality of genetics and biology, I think we were talking about the Dragon Riders of Pern earlier, same thing, right? So that's kind of where I land. Those are the titles that I enjoy as well.
Very cool. All right, over to you, John. What's your relationship with this wonderful
Well,
world?
I gotta agree. I lived in Gilead for freaking years and years, and I actually wrote my senior year thesis in high school on the Dark Tower. Yes, I'm old because only 4 of the books had come out at that point. But one thing I gotta we have to decide is what exactly would count as magic, because as we know, Arthur C. Clarke said any science that's sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. So calling it magic, I mean, you could call what Walter was doing as magic. You could literally call it magic. The doors between worlds, that's magic. It's hand waved away. You can go with I mean, you could call Star Wars fantasy because it's space fantasy. They don't explain anything. They just say it works, and these aren't the droids you're looking for. So you end up having to decide where is that line, and that line is blurry like my background. Okay. So we have to worry and we have to decide where that point is. Now, as far as what has been thrown in the chat right now, yeah, Dark Tower, where the wild things are. Talisman. The Talisman was one of my favorite Dark Tower tangential, and of course King and Straub wrote it, so duh. So those are pretty much places I lived and still do live.
Anna, over to you. What's your relationship with this?
So yeah, I think first, I agree fully with like what John said and what Nicole touched on, that when we talk about magic, we need to kind of understand so we have to define magic in a way. So in my day job, for example, I'm a biomedical scientist. So what we can do in the lab right now would seem like magic to my children, certainly, and some people who don't know this kind of science. And there definitely to people 100 years ago, it would seem like total magic. So the difference to me is that we're talking about something that's possible in the laws of in the scientific laws of this society. And I think this is what Nicole was also talking about. So fantasy by itself is something that, so it's set in a world that is like not our own. And then in this world, so there are abilities that are explainable by science, and then they're not magic, I think. And then they're not explainable by science, and then they would be magic. And I think actually a lot of fantasy that I enjoy doesn't depend. So sometimes, people throw in magic because, or like they call it magic. So often it doesn't depend on magic. And one of the examples I have is a Game of Thrones. I mean, the whole series, where I didn't realize there was magic in this book until maybe book 4 or 5, because it's history. It's kind of, it resembles our own in many gruesome and interesting ways. And it's kind of magic is there. It kind of comes up as an afterthought, and without any magic at all, this book would not lose anything to me. So so I enjoy fantasy not because of magic, but because of all these other things, of immersing myself in this like very different worlds and learning about them. And so in my own work, I've written something that's totally magical, and something that has, like my latest novel has no magic, and the only supernatural abilities absolutely explained by science. And I think it's kind of interesting to explore all these things, but I do enjoy fantasy that doesn't rely on magic, even if magic is part of the world, kind of creating the world. So yeah, so that's where I am.
It's such an interesting question. What do we define as magic? And so I think we could go through that a little bit. For me, one of the things that I might not define as magic is the ability to travel between worlds, which seems to be really important to a lot of this. And we can even, if we're talking about Star Wars, we could even talk about, the ability to travel between planets. That seems like a really key one to me. And I'm going to go around and ask you to identify other technological or other abilities that we don't necessarily classify. And I see John putting up his hand. I think you're muted, John.
Yep.
No, because I was trying to unmute by temporarily unmute, and it decided it was going to be fun. One thing I think we should also say is spoilers are going to happen in this.
Yeah.
Okay. If you have not read Game of Thrones or The Dark Tower or Dragon Rise of Pern or any of the stuff we're mentioning, just stick around. Just stick around. Because we're going to spoil the hell out of this stuff.
We are going to spoil the hell out of this stuff. So in challenging you to identify things that fantastic things that you can put in your work or that you like to read in other people's work that is really not magic. It's just the way the world works.
You mentioned travel between worlds. I think at some point on this panel, we're going to also have to define science fiction versus fantasy, right?
Yes.
We absolutely are. And we're going to do that. I think my next question is all about Dragon Riders of Pern. So we're going to get right in there.
So I definitely think that so let's talk about the Dark Tower and the bleeding of worlds, right? And so the whole reason that Roland's able to do this is because the tower is breaking down, right? So the barriers between worlds is collapsing. And so that's not magical. That's just the way in this series, the universe works. This tower that controls all these different worlds.
It's just physics.
There's all these different multiverses, right? Right, because actually there are different versions of everybody in some of these other worlds, which is how Jake ends up in our world. And you see that if you read more of the series. And so I do agree that there is some magic. And when I think about it, when you get further past Wizards and Glass, there's a lot more magic. But it's the functionality of the worlds or function of the world. So I think, someone said, I'm thinking about Star Wars as well. That I was trying to think of another one that it isn't like Stargate. Let's take that out. Like Stargate, there's a functioning gate that it's a mechanics that makes that happen, right? So it's not a part of our world. It's our way for exploring the universe. It's a technological thing that we use. It's not magic. It doesn't require a spell. It doesn't pull from a life force. It is machinery.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
and I would say Stargate isn't maybe even necessarily science fiction so much either.
Yeah, right. I think there are people in that world who would consider it totally to be magic. So if they're on this panel, they would argue with us.
That's true.
Yeah.
Going around to, let's see, who hasn't answered this question? Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe fantasy magic is in the eye of the beholder to some degree, but for me, I think that it's how fantastical things are explained in the story. So, there's a couple of different ways, and if we're showing that, it's a function of nature, and especially if that nature lines up with our own world, to me that reads more science fiction. So it might be something advanced that we can't understand, but if you're trying to explain it through that methodology, that makes sense. Versus explicitly calling it out, it's magic, or there's mages that are performing incantations, and that's how you're able to do something. That feels more like magic to me. And I think in probably the last 20 years, but I would say the last 10 to 15 years, I think the way fantasy as a genre, broadly speaking, of course, I'm painting with very broad brush here, thinks about magic is in some form or fashion of a rule or a system. You still have hand wavium, but in general, I think there's been more of a system. So, I would consider a lot of fantasy that has maybe some low magic to it, but there's no explanation. It's not really a system. It's almost like a force of nature. I would almost see that as fantasy without magic, I think, in the way that we view it today. Now, maybe, in the 90s or the 80s, we might have considered that to be fantasy with magic. But I think the way we've kind of transformed as a genre has pulled it in that direction. And me personally, I love the interplay of fantasy and science together in science fiction, probably because I read Anne McCaffrey as a child. And so that left an imprint on me. But I make no apologies for that.
No, never. John, over to you.
Okay. Highlander. Let's just throw that out there.
Okay.
That's that's fantasy. That's not but with zero magic. If we're going to go technically.
Okay, tell us more for those of us who Highlander.
Okay. All right. For those of you who have been under a rock for 30, almost 40. I'm old, okay? Almost 40 years. Highlander is essentially a bunch of immortals fighting. It's Darwinism at its finest. They cut off each other's heads, and in the end, there can be only one, and there should only have been one. But essentially, that was it. It's not magic. It's just survival of the fittest, and you get power from the immortal that you kill. Once you get that, the power is kind of nebulous and everything, and it's kind of magic almost, but it's also really no different than, say, the trading of genetic information when praying mantis's mate, and the female rips the head off the male. There you go.
Yeah.
So to me that is an epitome of fantasy without magic plus Queen. Okay,
Right.
I win the discussion.
Okay, so we all win. So the only thing that they get from killing another immortal person is immortality. What they don't get any.
So they already have immortality, but when they get around another one like them, they like drain each other's power, right? And so they have to,
after they cut off the head,
right? It's like a transfusion of energy. It's a life force. Here's some more life force.
So they're basically are they John Wicking through the world? Basically, they just want to kill. It's just
they don't want to, but if they are in the same place, they kind of have to, because there can be only one. And so,
gotcha.
Unless you're looking at the series, which was actually pretty good.
So you think both immortality and life force are kind of magical concepts, right?
Yes, for us. But like if you're Q on Star Trek, it's not, right? Yeah. Immortality is the way our beings exist. If you're the Doctor and renewing, it's not magic. That's just what you do. That's part of your biological evolution.
Exactly. Right? That's exactly where I was going.
Yeah, and the Highlander, I feel like that's their biological evolution. That's the way their bodies work. They have to, right? They don't have a choice because their body, that's how they function. That's how they exist. That's how they continue to exist. Yeah. But it is kind of fantastic in the sense that, they're walking around in kilts and it's big old swords, and it goes back to it's more urban fantasy than it is. Yeah, it's more urban fantasy than I think traditional fantasy, because it's that foreign supernatural element or paranormal element that's in a city.
And really, all supernatural means it's greater than natural. Doesn't mean that it's magical.
Right.
Does not.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it's super science or sorcery or anything. It's just greater than what is natural. So I mean, that's me being pedantic. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And I'm just going to go back to the name that I just dropped. John Wick.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantasy without magic? Yes, no? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
It's Keanu. Come on.
I mean, I know, exactly.
I think thumbs down.
Thumbs down, you think? Okay, so here's my pitch.
I think
I'm
urban fantasy
pitch because it is recognizably not our world.
Mm-hmm.
Are these, it is just simply not our world. Mm-hmm. And there are, the aesthetic is definitely fantasy-wise, right? It is very beautiful. It's very gritty. There are all of this deep world building that, that we can feel as though it goes a lot deeper than we see on the surface. So that's my pitch for John Wick.
I mean, I think you make a good point. I guess it's just, where do we want to cut off fantasy versus idealized versions of our world? I think Kill Bill would probably fall under the same definitions as John Wick in that regard, in a lot of ways.
And I'll agree with that. Absolutely.
And I love both movies. So, I mean, I think I'm okay with calling it fantasy. But I'm not sure if it's fantastic. I'm okay with calling it fantastical.
I think both are urban fantasy. I think we're not talking about urban fantasy because it has like a kind of a dirty. Some people think urban fantasy is just trashy paranormal romance, and it's really not.
I resemble that
Grittier-
remark.
No.
They are
We love
grittier
paranormal
stories.
romance. We love all genres. No
But let's
question.
let's
No,
also
not-
think about,
Of course, not anyone on this panel thinks that, but it does kind of have some connotation in certain circles that it's not real fantasy because it's set in cities, and the urban part plays a big role in that. But I feel like both Kill Bill and John Wick will fall into those categories because for otherness, but the otherness is set in urban settings. And so I kind of feel like that's where they would go.
but there's also, but look at the kung fu movies. If you want to look at that, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Mhm.
Tell me that, I mean, or any of the Shaolin.
But if you look at those aren't set in gritty American cities. Those are set in very lush, in the same way that medieval fantasy is set in prehistoric Japan or prehistoric China.
But there's no magic there.
No, of course. It's just well, it depends. Some of them do have that, but most of them don't. And they don't explain it. They just use the skill sets we have.
Yeah, I would.
As
I would
Ryan
buy
said,
that.
hand
I would
waving.
buy that. I think Anna's been
waving.
trying to get a word in edgewise here.
I apologize.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I feel like so if the story would do just as well without all the supernatural things, that's not really like, so if it doesn't depend on magic, what I'm trying to say, then it can classify as fantasy without magic, because Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, so they fly, yes, but if they didn't fly, if they just fought better than normal humans, but just kind of like in Kill Bill, it would still be the same story, and it wouldn't be talking if there's magic or not. So you mentioned Arthurian fantasies at the start. So one of my introductions to this type of fantasy was Marion Zimmer Bradley's Mists of Avalon. And that's a fantasy which pretty much doesn't have any magic. I mean, you can argue that there are mists and maybe like
I think that is a fantastic definition. If you could take out the fantastic and you have the same story,
right,
then it's not really fantasy at all.
Yeah.
All right, so what about worlds that don't have magic at all, but just, are our world divorced from reality? So I'm thinking, what, Amberlow? Your friend Amberlow? No, I'm seeing blinking.
No.
Okay, I'm gonna skip that because you haven't read it. Let's talk about Dragon Riders of Pern. And I want to talk about it because it was so important to me as a kid, as a teenager. Such good stuff. So who's the biggest Pernie here? Is it you, Ryan?
It might be, I don't know. I mean, I read them all. I haven't read them in a long time, but I devoured them from, I don't know, the ages of 10 to 14. I reread the whole series a couple of times.
Okay, well, give us a précis. You were the one, I think, who brought it up originally.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So it's an alien world. It's not Earth. It's dragons. So that screams fantasy. But there's no real magic that you can see. And at first it almost seems like it's, I don't want to say primitive society. That's not quite the right term, but it's a society that has dragons and can do cool things, but without magic. But at the same time, it's clear that life is not easy and that they're in almost like a rebuilding phase.
It's kind of feudal, right?
It is feudal.
There's castes.
It is feudal. There's caste systems. There's a hierarchy. It's not what you would consider like as science fiction, and there's no magic there. So I think that's fantasy without magic. Now, over time, as you start to explore the world through characters, through additional books, you start to realize that there's, what they think of, I don't even think that they think of it as magic, but they know they don't understand what this is. And they start to realize, and kind of the big reveal is that, they came there and their ancestors came there as spacefaring people and crashed on this planet. And, they use some of that to kind of, it's almost like archaeology at some point in some of the books. Now, the one thing that I will say that it's not magic, but it is close to it, is the fact that there's this thread that is like basically like fiery comet type things that are coming down and will destroy the planet. And so they use the dragons to destroy these threads, and the dragons have to eat this stone that then gives them fire. but again, I don't think it reads as magic. It's not hand wavium. It feels like it's a natural part of this alien planet to us. So it always seemed fantastical to me. And then I realized that, wait, actually, I think there's science to this. And, you know, as a young kid growing up, that like blew my mind.
Me too.
So good. I don't think that series has ever been surpassed.
I don't think so either.
No, I mean, I love it. I love it.
Mhm.
I haven't read it in a long time. I hope it's aged well, but as a kid, I really loved it.
Yeah. Well, it's something to aspire to write something that formative and that spectacularly original. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would be pretty amazing. So that brings us to the question of writing. We're all writers. How do we write stuff? How do we approach it? How do you just decide no magic in this? I'm not doing magic. I'm done with magic.
It depends
Yeah. It really does depend.
on what the story, what you're trying to do with the story. If you decide, if you can take a story and have it have everything explained away with if you just take magic, then you have like can do anything you want. But if you go with the the dragons are actually an alien life form, then you got to work that in, and you've just removed a chunk of magic and turned it into zoology. And them creating fire from these stones becomes biology, and you start removing the magic, and you explain more in a scientific point of view, which, you know, I don't do. I just say the F word a lot and hopefully get through it all.
You don't do science? Not science.
No, I do science. I do science a lot, but again, I turn into Tony Stark and immediately core dump it once I'm done with it. So,
Right. And I'm gonna go up to you, Nicole, because we haven't heard your lovely voice in a while. How do you approach this stuff when you write, and why do you?
So I have two kind of fantastic series. The first one it's called the Minister Knights of Souls, and they use orbs to extract people's souls. And so there's definitely, when I sat down to write the series, it already had a magical element and a system for how that magic works, like what they can do, what they can't do, the results of using it. And so that had to be set up in place when I was doing the world building. But when I sat down to write the Kingdom of Avis series, I knew it was going to be more investigative, kind of mystery, right? I call it my Criminal Minds with Feathers series. And so I knew that there wouldn't be a lot of magic per se, because Prentice doesn't do magic. She just has this ability. And so that's the way that system works. Birds don't really do magic. But there are some that do, but it depends. There's a system here as well. But it's very low magic, as Ryan mentioned earlier. And I knew that going in, that the magic would be low, if any at all. But I planned it from, like, when I do world building, I had to plan, right, what I wanted to take place. And so I knew before I started writing the actual stories if there was going to be magic or not.
That makes sense. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah, so I actually really like magic, and I like it mostly as a character development tool, because if you put your character in a situation where you can like give them some extreme challenges, like you can challenge them to the end basically, and that reveals the character like nothing else could. And I think this is another reason I also like romance for this reason, because another way to challenge your character is like in romantic situations. But so I think magic is a great tool, but when I approach world, so I usually start my books with extensive world building, and it kind of naturally comes to, so sometimes magic is reasonable in this world and sometimes it's not. And it's not because of technology, just so, for example, my Magyat code books were set like in a European kind of multicultural empire where people had magic and there was like anti-magic laws and magic was against it. So then Shadowblade is set in a kind of similar world with similar sword fighting, but magic wasn't natural in this world, and I can't even describe. I can't explain why, but it just kind of so everything supernatural had to be explained by some natural laws. So it's kind of yes. I don't know why. As I feel like it's like the book chose this for me rather than I chose it. I also have a very early book in which like the main character was a jinn who had absolute power, so he could do anything. But of course the jinn, as you know, it comes with this constraint that he can only do it if somebody orders him to, but not by himself. So that was another, so if I feel like if you have magic, you might as well like make it absolute, but I think all of these different things have different place in different stories. And another thing is that I do think that good fantasy doesn't depend on the magic. Even though magic could be like a very intricate element of this fantasy, the story would be the same if you take away the magic. So because it's basically about people.
That's such a good insight. It's a great insight, Anna. Thanks. Ryan, we grilled you about Pern, and now we're going to grill you about how you do this genre. How do you take it? How do you make it?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't have I haven't written a book or have a series that has no magic in it. I tend to be a fan of some rules-based magic, but that said, you know, my current series, my main characters don't have magic. I really like that aspect that they're kind of everyday people. They're not chosen ones, they're ones that chose themselves. And so, you know, when I'm writing those worlds, I'm still looking for the fantastical. So, you know, it's a quasi Mediterranean Caribbean world building set in just before pre-industrial age with like gear work, you know, ships that are propelled across the water by, you know, complex gears that seem almost magical and things like that. There's a whole gearwork city. There's a city that's built within the bones of these fallen giants that people think might be gods but aren't quite sure.
Very
And
cool.
so to me, that's the thing. If you're writing fantasy without magic, it should be fantastical. It should read as, you know, wow, I'd love to see that, or I wish I could be there, or I can imagine it, but I've never seen that before. You know, I think of it as if you're ever fortunate enough to get out in nature, or even just go to a beautiful city, and you kind of get that vista at some point that just takes your breath away. To me, that's what fantasy without magic is, and that's what fantasy should be, period. But fantasy without the magic is still fantastical. It's dreamlike, and it kind of takes your breath away. And so that's what I'm looking for when I'm writing are, you know, what are the scenes, the descriptions, the cool moments of awesome that are going to make the reader kind of lose their breath for a moment and think, wow, I wish I was there.
Love it. All right, we have 10 minutes left. I'm going to start going through the questions. Jeff Beeler asks, what are your favorite little used historical settings, and why did you pick them?
So I have to point out that there's a panel at 8:30, which is totally dedicated to this.
Is that? what's that panel called?
So it's I forgot the actual name, so it's the underused historical period.
Okay, so Jeff, we're gonna pass on that question for you, unless anybody's got something they're dying to
hope you
get
guys attend that, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't answer it or not.
I'm not seeing anybody dying to answer it, so I'm going to go down to, so Jeff, we're going to refer you to the panel at 8:30. Danny says, Ted Chiang says that his religion story, Hell is the Absence of God, is straight fantasy because it takes place in a universe where the scientific method doesn't work. And there are angels and souls and heaven and hell and Yahweh. But aside from that, it's basically the modern world. Would you agree that this sounds like fantasy?
I'm not going to argue with Ted Chiang.
No. If he said it's fantasy.
I'll argue just to be contrary, but you know, other than that, no, I'll agree with that.
It sounds like fantasy to me.
Yeah.
Especially since when we started at the panel, we were throwing the word fantasy around pretty widely. So yeah, we'll go with Ted. Thank you, Ted. Write more stuff.
Seriously.
Right? Jeff says, my favorite example of fantasy without magic is Ellen Kushner's Swords Point. Thank you. Yes. In fact, it feels more like fantasy to me than plenty of stories that do have magic, but I've had trouble pinning down just why it feels so much like fantasy to me. Comments? The aesthetic.
Yeah.
Ooh. I mean, the swords fighting thing, and
Well, it's
yeah.
fantasy.
Well, I mean,
anybody-
look at the Princess Bride. I mean, in the entire movie, there's only Miracle Max, and well, what does he do? He puts a little chocolate on it, so it goes down easier. That's it. That's the extent of magic in the Princess
Mhm.
Bride. So you could call that fantasy without magic. And in this case, I'm gonna equate, exactly that to what Jeff was saying. So yeah.
Yeah. So Swords Point, you may know, has sequels on what used to be Serial Box and is now Realm, Tremontaine. You might want to check that out if you want more Swords Point. And keep pondering the question of why it feels so much like fantasy. Danny asks, if magic is understood and systematized to the point of being essentially a science, for example, Robert Bennett Jackson's Boundary Side, which I'm not familiar with, does it still count as magic?
No. I'm just gonna put my foot down and say no.
It does.
Does
It's magic.
Does it depend on the special effects?
Yeah.
I think it depends on. Sorry, Anna, go ahead. I've been talking too
Go
much.
ahead, sorry. No, I was reminding that we kind of, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No worries. No, I think it does count as magic. It's one of the more rules-based magic systems that I mentioned. Epic fantasy in particular has really kind of become known for, probably since Sanderson was kind of trending that direction. He popularized it. There's been many since. But I think in that case, because of the setting and some of the other things, it's clear that it's magical. It's not like a force of nature in my mind. And so it is very, like, they've figured out a way to do this magic, but it feels like magic. It's not a great answer. I'd love to hear Robert talk about it a little bit more. I think he described it as like magical programming. And programmers that are doing magic, but I do think that still is magic. I think science fiction is much more mathematical based. It's much more laws of science based. And so, certainly you can get like Star Wars, which is more probably space fantasy, but I think in this case it is, to my mind anyway. And I'll be in the Discord to chat later. Happy to talk through it.
I think I would agree with John. So I'm a hardcore fantasy fan, and to me, the difference between science fiction and fantasy, so it's blurry. It's not as clear as we all think. But like if it's technological, if it has science, it's not fantasy. But at the same time, if it's historical and people are wearing historical costumes and speaking old language, it's fantasy, even if they have like some science in there. So, and I think this becomes very personal. What qualifies as science fiction or fantasy to different people. But yeah, I think to me, the fantasy I enjoy is usually historical and based on the past rather than the future. And I would feel like science belongs to more of the futuristic things. Yeah, so I wouldn't classify it as fantasy.
What's your thought, Nicole? What do you think on this?
I agree with Ryan. You could have a systematic magic system and it still be fantasy, even to the point where it's like it's science-like. And you saw that with Full Metal Alchemist, the anime. It was very systematic in the way that they did their alchemy, but it was still magic and it was still fantasy. Only in the sense that, because fantasy isn't, and I agree with Ryan here, isn't just comprised of one characteristic. There's a plethora of other boxes that are ticked that makes it a fantasy.
So we're evenly split. Nicole, Ryan, yay.
Yeah.
John and Anna, nay. All right, going on down to another question. Is anyone here familiar with the Gormenghast trilogy? Thank you again. Yes, amazing fantasy with no magic. Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake. Islandia by Austin Tappan Wright, which I don't know. And the Ambergris stories by Jeff Vandermeer. I don't know that one either. None have any magic or even science fictional elements, but are set in detailed imaginary worlds. Maybe in the eye of the beholder, whether it's fantasy or not. Maybe it's fantasy if you're a fantasy reader and you love it, right? If you love fantasy above all else and you love something that feels like fantasy, but maybe isn't, then you call it fantasy. We all love it. What do you think? Yeah. Don Urbanski, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. I'm sorry. I was just gonna,
Yeah, that's okay. Danny Scheel, Gods, Monsters, and Lucky Peaches, science fiction from the viewpoint, that's my book, of future people, but fantasy from the viewpoint of past people. That's very true. Thanks, Danny. That's nice. Cool.
So there's
Kind
a
of a bit of a
question
thrill.
about psychic abilities. Whether, did I miss that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, again, the eye of the beholder, right? So the technological people think they're living in a science fiction world, and the historical people are very, they have no evidence of actually magic working, but they believe in magic.
I think it would depend whether it's in a science fiction or a fantasy novel to me, but
yeah, that's true.
Both ways. So
All
sorry,
right.
I looked up the name of the panel. It's overused and underused historical references.
At 8:30?
8:30, yes.
Excellent. Cool. We have like a minute left. I'm going to ask each of you to plug the thing that you want people to buy. Nicole, give us your title.
I would really love for you to start my Kingdom of Ava series. It's called Kill 3 Birds. You can find it on Amazon and a bunch of online places, as well as in certain bookstores, independent bookstores. Kill 3 Birds, a Kingdom of Ava's mystery.
Excellent. John.
Amazon.com/author/John G. Walker. That's the Stadford, where you can find my books, namely the Stadford Chronicles, again, Magnum PI meets American Gods. And I'd really like you to just leave a review, please.
Yes, please do. It really, really matters. Leave reviews. Anna,
So
what do you want
actually,
them to buy?
the one book that I enjoyed the most writing is called The Guild of Assassins. It's on Amazon, but it's the middle book in my trilogy. So
The Gilded Lessons?
The Guild of Assassins.
Ah.
Sorry. Yeah, but then my latest book is Shadowblade, and I also have an Amazon page, which has a bunch of them.
And Ryan.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so if you haven't checked out my work, The Sin in the Steel, it's sort of Pirates of the Caribbean meets Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes with a female protagonist who kicks ass. And the hardcover is discounted lower than the paperback price right now. So you should pick that up. And in July, the sequel, The Justice and Revenge, drops, and the whole trilogy is done. The next one comes the following year. So
The
would love for you
Justice
to check it
in
out.
Revenge?
Yep.
Nice.
Awesome.
And for myself, my short story collection, Alias Space, is fresh off the presses and includes some secret writing tips in it. So, all right, this has been an absolutely fantastic panel. Thank you all for your amazing, amazing insights. And I've just had such a good time with you. Sorry, The Sin in the Steel, not The Sin in the Seal. All right. And if you want to continue the discussion, please go to St. George on Discourse after this meeting. Thank you, everybody. You're amazing. I've had such a good time with you.
You were a great moderator. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Good. It's a great topic, and you are amazing people. All right, bye.
Bye, I'll miss you all.
See you all.
Bye, books, fireworks, and confetti. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.